Have you ever noticed how that thing you wanted so badly, that new phone, that promotion, that perfect vacation felt incredible for a little while? And then, almost without warning, its magic faded. That new phone now feels ordinary. The promotion just means more work. And the memories of the trip, they blur into Instagram posts you barely scroll through anymore. Then, a new craving appears. A shinier car, a bigger house. More likes, more followers, more applause. And before you realize it, you're chasing again. It's like a thirst that keeps coming back, no matter how much you drink. But have you ever truly stopped to ask yourself why? Why is it that no matter what we achieve, buy, experience, or hold in our hands, it never seems to be enough? Not for long, anyway. The ancient Buddhists had a word for this relentless hunger. They called it Tanha, a craving, a burning desire that endlessly whispers, "Just one more, then you'll be happy." It sounds harmless. After all, isn't it normal to want things, to dream, to strive, to reach for something better? But what if this very mechanism, this constant wanting, is the hidden root of every restless night, every quiet dissatisfaction, every subtle ache you feel when the world grows silent around you? The Buddha taught that this craving isn't just a part of life, it's the engine of suffering. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. This craving doesn't just attach to physical things. It clings to ideas, to status, to validation. It can be a hunger for pleasure, but also a hunger to escape pain. A craving to exist, or sometimes a craving not to exist. It's an invisible chain tightening around your mind, dragging you through highs and lows, forever chasing, forever fleeing. The tragedy is, most of us don't even notice the chain. We confuse this restless longing for ambition. We mistake temporary highs for happiness. And we let the world convince us that the next thing will finally fill the emptiness. But the cycle continues. You climb the mountain only to see a higher peak ahead. And maybe, just maybe, you felt it too. That moment at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling wondering, is this all there is? That aching sense that no matter how much you accumulate, there's a void that things cannot touch. If you have, you're not alone. And no, you're not broken. This isn't a personal flaw. It's a deeply human condition, wired into the very fabric of our existence. But here's the beautiful, liberating truth. What you're seeking isn't out there in the next purchase, the next title, the next lover, or the next fleeting thrill. It's hidden in plain sight, in the spaces between your desires, in the moments you stop chasing, in the stillness most of us fear to enter. And the ancient teachings of the Buddha didn't just name this invisible hunger. They mapped it, dissected it, and revealed a path to freedom. A path not of denying life's pleasures or ambitions, but of understanding their nature so deeply, so honestly, that you're no longer a prisoner to them. Imagine that. Desires still come and go, but they no longer drag you by the collar. Pleasures still arrive, but you savor them without clinging. Losses still happen, but you aren't shattered by them. You move through life weightless, engaged, yet unattached. This isn't theory. It's a lived experience available to anyone willing to look deeper. And it begins with a question far older than philosophy, far older than religion. What is this craving inside me? Where does it come from? And what happens when I stop feeding it? In the next few moments, we'll step into the ancient wisdom that holds the answers. We'll explore the 3 forms this craving takes, how it secretly shapes your choices, your relationships, and even your identity. And perhaps most importantly, how you can finally loosen its grip, not by fighting it, but by seeing it clearly. So take a breath. Let's go where few dare to look, into the heart of desire itself. So here's the thing about craving. It isn't just one single feeling. It wears different masks. It changes shape, slipping quietly into your thoughts, your habits, your choices, without you ever realizing it. And if you don't know what it looks like, you'll spend your entire life chasing ghosts. The Buddha, over 2,500 years ago, uncovered something astonishingly precise. He identified not one but 3 distinct forms of craving, each one quietly pulling the strings behind your decisions. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Let's name them: Kama Tanha, Bhava Tanha, Vibhava Tanha. Or in simpler words, craving for pleasure, craving for existence, and craving for non-existence. Let's break them open. First, the craving for pleasure, Kama Tanha, it's the most obvious. The craving for what feels good, tastes, sights, sounds, sensations, ideas, people, experiences. That rush you feel scrolling through endless reels. The dopamine hit when someone likes your post. The hunger for the perfect meal, the perfect partner, the perfect moment. This craving whispers, more, just a little more, then you'll be happy. But here's the catch: pleasure fades. The sweetest song grows old. The best wine becomes routine. The laughter dies down, and so you chase again. It's a treadmill with no finish line. And the more you run, the more exhausted you become, while believing the next prize will finally satisfy you. Second, the craving for existence. Bhava Tanha, this one's sneakier. It's the craving not just for things, but for being. The desire to become someone, to build an identity, to craft a self-image you can present to the world. It's why we're obsessed with titles, labels, and status. Why we cling to who we think we are: the successful one, the spiritual one, the rebel, the victim, the achiever. It's a hunger to exist as something solid in a world that's constantly shifting. We chase roles, identities, careers, relationships, desperate to feel real, to feel significant. And yet, identities crumble, careers end, beauty fades, followers forget, but the craving remains, morphing into new forms. It's not about what you are, it's about needing to be something, anything, to prove you exist. Third, the craving for non-existence. Vibhava Tanha, perhaps the strangest, yet one you've surely felt in dark, quiet moments. It's the craving to escape, not just from pain, but from existence itself, from responsibilities, from emotions, from life's relentless weight. It shows up in our addictions, in the numbing scroll through endless videos, in the drinking, the distractions, the endless busyness. It's the longing for the world to just stop, for your worries to dissolve, for the crushing awareness of being alive to vanish. Some chase it through oblivion, some through denial, some through endless sleep or worse. But even this craving is a form of desire, the desire not to desire. And like the others, it too keeps you trapped in suffering's cycle. When you step back and look at it clearly, these three cravings aren't just random feelings you occasionally experience. They're the architects of your entire life. They shape your goals, your relationships, your fears, your secret obsessions. They make you run toward pleasure, build illusions of identity, and seek escape from discomfort. And unless you see them for what they are, you'll keep moving in circles, thinking you're chasing freedom, while you're really chasing shadows. But here's the beauty. The moment you can name them, they begin to lose their power. The pleasure you once clung to becomes just a passing sensation. The identity you defended so fiercely becomes just a role you play. The escape you sought so desperately reveals itself as a dead end. And in that clarity, something extraordinary happens. A space opens up. A quiet, weightless space where you no longer have to react automatically. Where you can watch a craving rise and fall like a wave without drowning in it. This is where real freedom begins. Not in suppressing desire, not in chasing it, but in seeing it clearly. In the next chapter, we'll unravel why this craving feels so powerful, so irresistible, and how it weaves its web through every corner of your mind. We'll go deeper into the root causes of desire itself, and why, even when you know better, you keep reaching for what ultimately leaves you empty. And trust me, it's not what you think. There's a reason desire feels so heavy, so relentless. It isn't random. It isn't new. It's rooted in something ancient, something woven into the very fabric of the human mind. For centuries, Buddhist wisdom has spoken of three poisons. Not sins, not moral failings, but forces. Currents in the mind that quietly, persistently shape the way you see the world and move through it. And desire is the first, but not alone. It walks hand in hand with two others, and together, they hold a grip over every restless heart. Greed, the endless hunger. Imagine a flame. The more it consumes, the brighter it burns. And the brighter it burns, the more it needs. This is greed. It's not just wanting things. It's believing you need them to feel whole, that without them you are less. It hides behind beautiful disguises. The longing for new experiences, the hunger for recognition, the chase for affection. It whispers, if I have this, if I become that, then I'll finally be enough. But every time the desire is met, the emptiness quietly returns, because it was never about the object. It was about the grasping, the reaching, the never enough. It's a cycle so smooth, so familiar, you rarely notice how it drains the life from your days. Hatred, the fire that burns back. When something stands between you and what you crave, a person, a situation, a reality you can't control, frustration rises. And from frustration, hatred is born. Not always loud, not always violent. Often it's a quiet bitterness, a cold distance, a slow, simmering anger toward those who have what you wanted or those who dared to deny you. Hatred isn't separate from desire. It's what happens when desire feels threatened, a reflex to push away what hurts, to punish what resists. And the irony, in that pushing, in that heat, you suffer twice. Delusion, the most dangerous mist. Then there's delusion, the most seductive poison, because you rarely see it coming. Delusion convinces you the thing you're chasing will finally be the one that lasts. It paints fantasies of future happiness. It makes promises no object, no person, no achievement can keep. It lets you believe the stories you tell yourself, that you need this person to feel alive, that you'll be at peace once you arrive at some imagined destination, that this time will be different. It's the fog that blinds you to the impermanence of everything you chase, the trick of the mind that makes you reach for what will dissolve in your hands. And as long as you're under its spell, the chase continues. The invisible hand behind every desire. These three poisons don't live in separate corners of your mind. They feed each other. Desire gives rise to frustration. Frustration fuels hatred. Hatred deepens delusion. And delusion inflames desire again. Round and round. A wheel that spins whether you notice it or not. They shape your choices, your relationships, your moods. The subtle tension in your chest when things don't go your way. The quiet ache in moments when you should feel content but somehow you don't. And what's most astonishing, we inherit this cycle from ancestors long forgotten, from a mind designed to want, to cling, to fear, not because you're flawed, but because you're human. The Buddha didn't name these poisons to condemn us. He named them so we could see them, and in seeing, loosen their grip. Because the moment you recognize desire not as a need but as a pattern, when you catch hatred rising as a reaction, not a truth, when you notice the stories you tell yourself before they take root, you begin to wake up. And in those brief moments of clarity, life feels different, lighter, wider. There's a strange, quiet power in watching a craving rise and letting it pass, in seeing anger swell and offering it no place to land, in noticing the fantasy and choosing presence instead. It's not easy. It was never meant to be, but it's possible. And when it happens, even for a breath, you'll know what freedom tastes like, not because you forced it, but because for the first time you saw the strings pulling you, and you chose to let them fall. The next step isn't to resist desire, nor to fear it, but to understand where it comes from, why it feels so powerful, and how, without your awareness, it took root so long ago. The soil it grows from might surprise you. For so long, we've been told desire is the enemy, that to want is to suffer, that if you truly seek peace, you must abandon craving altogether. But what if that isn't the whole story? What if it's not desire itself, but the kind of desire that shapes your fate? Because in the ancient language of Pali, the Buddha spoke not of one desire but two, Tanha and Chanda. And between them lies the line between bondage and liberation. Tanha means thirst, but not the kind you quench with water. It's the aching, grasping hunger that demands something outside of you to feel complete. It's when you chase a new possession, a new title, a new lover, believing this one will fix it. It's compulsive, insatiable, and it always leaves you emptier than before. Tanha whispers, "When I have this, I'll finally be happy." And when you get it, a new hunger rises, a new ache, like drinking salt water to soothe your thirst. This is the kind of desire the Buddha warned about, the craving that binds you to the wheel of suffering. Because no matter how much you feed it, it grows stronger, not because the world is cruel, but because everything you cling to is temporary. The body ages, praise fades, pleasure decays, and so the thirst returns. But then there's Chanda, a different kind of desire altogether, not a grasping, but a calling. Chanda is the wholesome, noble wish to grow, to understand, to become better, not for the sake of ego, but from a place of clarity. It's the gentle but steady pull toward meaning, the urge to master a skill, to help a stranger, to deepen your wisdom. It's desire without attachment, ambition without obsession. Chanda arises when you want something not because you believe it will save you, but because it aligns with the deeper current of who you are. It says, "I wish to do this, to learn this, to offer this, not because it will make me worthy, but because it's beautiful to try." It's the kind of desire that uplifts rather than enslaves, the fire that warms without burning. This difference isn't just philosophical, it's practical, it's daily. Most people live without ever distinguishing between Tanha and Chanda, and so they mistake their compulsions for purpose, their insecurities for ambition. They climb ladders that lead nowhere. They chase people who were never meant to stay. They acquire things they didn't truly want. And every time they feel the emptiness creep in, they assume it means they just need more. But the problem was never how much, it was what kind. How do you tell the difference? The clue is in the feeling. Tanha is urgent, grasping. It feels like an itch you have to scratch immediately. It says, "If I don't get this now, I'll be miserable." Chanda, on the other hand, feels spacious. It isn't frantic, it doesn't threaten you, it invites you. It feels like a steady light in your chest, not a fever. Even when it calls you to difficult things, to sacrifice, to effort, it doesn't tighten your throat. It expands your heart. And here's the beautiful paradox. When you act from Chanda, the outcome matters less, because the act itself is fulfilling. The journey itself carries meaning. Whether you succeed or fail becomes secondary to the sincerity of the attempt. You know this difference. You've tasted it. That quiet satisfaction after helping someone without expecting credit. The joy of learning something new for the sheer wonder of it. The deep peace after doing something hard, not for recognition, but because it mattered to you. In those moments, you weren't chasing approval. You weren't trying to fill a hole. You were simply moving in alignment with something clean, something whole. That's Chanda, and it's always been within you. The Buddha wasn't asking you to strip yourself of all desire. He was asking you to see it clearly, to know which desires enslave you, and which ones set you free. Because a life without aspiration isn't wisdom, it's stagnation. What matters is whether you're chasing illusions or following what is real. It's, which kind of desire is living inside me right now? The answer to that will quietly shape everything. Some cravings promise peace but deliver chains. Others demand courage and offer freedom. And in the next breath, when desire rises again, as it always will, you'll have a choice. Will you drink salt water, or will you choose what truly nourishes? Desire isn't the enemy, not anymore, because now you see it. And anything you can see clearly, you can work with, you can reshape, you can transform. This is where the real practice begins. Not in denying your desires, but in understanding them so deeply they lose their power to control you. And something quieter, wiser, takes their place. Most people's relationship with desire is either indulgence or suppression. They either chase it blindly or try to stamp it out. But both paths miss the heart of the Buddha's teaching. The real transformation starts when you can simply notice desire arise and do nothing. No rush to act. No panic to repress, just notice. Feel it move through your body. See the story it tells in your mind. Maybe it says, "If I have this, I'll be safe." Or, "I won't be happy until I get that." or I deserve this because they have it too. Listen carefully. The mind's stories are like old songs on a loop, familiar, predictable, and often untrue. And the more you witness them without getting tangled, the less grip they have. You realize, I am not this craving. I am the awareness watching it. And in that single shift, you've already begun to weaken its hold. Desire doesn't appear out of nowhere. It always comes from something deeper, a fear, a wound, a longing to feel whole. The Buddha taught that every craving is built on a fundamental misunderstanding. That satisfaction lies outside of us. That something out there will finally make us enough. But it never does. So ask yourself, what is this desire trying to protect me from? What is it trying to fill? What fear is it covering up? The desire for status may be a disguise for old loneliness. The craving for control might hide a fear of uncertainty. The obsession with pleasure could mask a dread of meaninglessness. When you trace a desire to its root, it loses its illusion of necessity. It becomes just a feeling, a passing impulse. And in that moment, you are free to respond, not react. Here's the part most people miss: desire is raw energy. It isn't inherently bad or good. It's like fire. It can burn down your house, or it can warm you through the darkest night. Once you recognize a craving, you don't have to kill it. You can shift it. The Buddha called this right effort, taking the restless, hungry energy of unwholesome desire and redirecting it towards something nourishing. A craving for attention can become a wish to genuinely connect. A hunger for wealth can become a drive to offer security to others. An obsession with success can evolve into a deeper commitment to mastery and meaning. You don't suppress the fire. You tend it, you shape it, until it lights the path ahead instead of consuming you. But perhaps the most radical, most quietly defiant act in a world addicted to craving is to choose contentment, not the dull resignation of giving up, but the steady, luminous peace of realizing this moment is already enough. The Buddha spoke of santutthi, a simple, joyful satisfaction with what is. It doesn't mean you stop growing. It means your peace is no longer dependent on the next thing. You can want, you can strive, you can build, but from a place of fullness, not lack. This is where Chanda lives, in the fertile ground of contentment. When you're no longer trying to fill a hole, your desires soften. They become choices, not compulsions. And your life begins to align not with what the world shouts you should chase, but with what quietly, wordlessly feels true. And finally, remember, everything you crave is temporary. Every feeling, every high, every possession, every title. Like mist on a morning lake, it will rise and fade. This isn't a reason for despair. It's the source of wisdom. Because once you see the impermanence of what you chase, you stop clinging so tightly. And what remains is gratitude. Not the kind you force, but the natural, effortless gratitude of a heart no longer enslaved. You start to find beauty not just in the peaks, but in the quiet, ordinary moments. The sound of rain on leaves, a long breath before dawn, the knowing smile of someone who understands. And then, paradoxically, life becomes richer than it ever was when you were chasing more. So maybe the task isn't to silence your desires, but to become so clear, so still, that you see them for what they are. Temporary visitors. Some wise, some foolish. None of them you. And in that clarity, you learn to walk with them, not be ruled by them, to let the worthy ones stay, and release the rest into the wind. And slowly, what remains is peace. Somewhere in the ancient forests of India, over 2,500 years ago, there was a man who had everything: wealth, power, pleasure, prestige. He lived surrounded by silk curtains and golden ornaments, the fragrance of lotus blooms in the air. Every desire was within reach, and yet his heart was restless. His name was Siddhartha, the man who would become the Buddha, but at that time he was just like us, a seeker trapped in the endless chase for more. He had tasted every sweetness the world could offer, and somehow the hunger only grew. One night, slipping beyond the palace walls, Siddhartha came face to face with what no one had ever let him see: an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a wandering ascetic, serene, unburdened. In those 4 sights, something shattered within him. The illusion that satisfaction could be found in the world's pleasures was gone. He saw that everything he clung to would slip through his fingers. Every person he loved, every pleasure he chased, every title he held destined to fade. And in that instant his desire transformed, not into apathy, not into despair, but into a fierce, luminous longing for truth. Not the fleeting satisfaction of the senses, but the deep, unshakable peace of understanding life as it truly is. The Buddha's genius wasn't in destroying desire, it was in refining it, turning blind craving into conscious aspiration. He left behind his silk robes and golden dishes, not out of hatred for them, but because he saw their limits. He traded them for a begging bowl and the open road. For 6 long years he starved, denied, deprived. He chased enlightenment like a man chasing a mirage. Until one day, weak and exhausted beneath the Bodhi tree, he realized even this was another form of craving. The desire to escape suffering was itself a cause of suffering. And so he let go, he stopped chasing. He sat, not hoping, not resisting, just watching the rise and fall of breath, the flickering movements of thought, the subtle tug of old desires, and in that stillness something opened. He saw the nature of craving, its origin, its consequences, its ending, and in that understanding, freedom. The Buddha's story isn't just ancient history, it's the map of every human heart. Because each of us lives with our own illusions of permanence, our own obsessions and hungers. Some of us chase wealth, others approval, some crave control, others escape. We tell ourselves, when I have this, I'll be happy. But it's a mirage, a moving horizon. And yet, hidden inside every craving is a clue, a message. It's pointing to something deeper, a longing not for things but for peace, not for experiences but for understanding. What you truly desire isn't the thing you chase. It's the state you believe it will give you. And once you see this, you can stop running. Like the Buddha beneath the tree, you realize the answer isn't in fighting desire or in endlessly feeding it. It's in turning toward it, watching its dance without being swept away, feeling its pull without losing your center. And over time, desire changes. Craving for possession becomes appreciation. Obsession with control becomes surrender. Yearning for pleasure becomes a quiet joy in simple things. And the same restless energy that once led you in circles begins to carry you home. Home to a mind that no longer clings, a heart that no longer needs constant feeding. A peace that arises not because everything is perfect, but because you've stopped demanding it to be. Paradoxically, when the old cravings fade, a new kind of desire is born, not for possessions, not for status, but for wisdom, for compassion, for freedom, not just for yourself, but for all beings. The Buddha called this Chanda. It's the kind of desire that doesn't chain you to suffering, but leads you beyond it. It's not a hunger you must fill, but a light that gently draws you forward. And slowly, without fanfare, your life begins to change. You speak with more kindness. You listen with more patience. You let go with less fear. You walk through the same world, but you are no longer ruled by it. This is the quiet miracle the Buddha pointed to, not a life without desire, but a life where desire serves wisdom, where the restless hunger for more dissolves into a deep, unshaken contentment, a life where the old craving for having is replaced by a luminous longing to be free. And that longing, that pure, steady flame, becomes your path. Somewhere inside you, that seed is already there. The question is, will you water it? So here we are, after walking through ancient forests with Siddhartha, after peering into the restless heart of craving, after untangling the difference between hunger that chains you and aspiration that frees you. It leads us back to a simple question. What is desire to you? Not to philosophers, not to monks in distant temples, not to texts written in ink 1,000 years old, but to you, the one sitting here, listening, breathing in this exact moment. Maybe you've spent years running from your desires, fighting them, suppressing them. Maybe you believed that to be good, you had to be free of wanting. To be pure, you had to kill every craving. But desire was never the enemy. It was a messenger, a mirror, a teacher disguised as a temptation. It reflected your hunger to feel alive, to be seen, to belong, to matter. And beneath every restless wanting, there was always something softer, something simpler, the longing for peace. Not the peace of perfect circumstances, but the peace of no longer being ruled by the chase. Life will never stop offering you things to want. That's the nature of being human. You'll still feel the pull of a new job title, the ache for someone's approval, the urge for one more pleasure, one more escape. But now you see it. You recognize that every craving carries a question. Do you own this desire, or does it own you? And in that tiny, invisible moment between the pull and your response, you are free. Not because the world stopped tempting you, not because you've transcended human longing, but because you've learned how to meet desire with clarity, to smile at it, to listen to what it's pointing toward, and to choose whether to follow, to release, or to transform it. The Buddha taught that true wealth isn't the absence of desire, it's the wisdom to direct it well, a craving for wisdom, a longing for kindness, a hunger to live this brief, beautiful life without wasting it chasing things that don't last. And you don't need to be a monk to do this. You don't have to abandon your job, your family, your phone. You just need to notice, to pause, to ask yourself, is this leading me deeper into the fog or toward the clearing? And over time, those small choices carve a path, not a straight line to enlightenment, but a winding, imperfect, very human journey toward peace. A peace that can sit inside you, even in the middle of chaos. A contentment so quiet it hums beneath every craving, whispering, "You are already enough." So maybe the question isn't whether desire is good or bad, whether to destroy it or indulge it. Maybe the only question worth asking is, where is this desire taking me? And when you can answer that honestly, without self-deception, without judgment, you're no longer its prisoner. You become its master. And slowly, step by step, you build a life not dictated by the restless hunger for more, but guided by the steady flame of what truly matters to you. This is not the end of the path. It's the start of a different kind of conversation, one between you and your heart, between you and this strange, beautiful, restless thing we call desire. And if you listen closely, it might just show you the way home.